The fortress stood silent in the frozen heart of France. The year was 1396. Its grey stone walls trapped the chill like a secret, and the wind hissed through the arrow slits as though mourning something yet to die. In a small, echoing chamber, a young girl stood still as marble. Her attendants moved around her with the solemn rhythm of ceremony, preparing her for a night history would rather forget. Her name was Isabel of Valois. If you're drawn to raw, unpolished history, consider subscribing and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. She was 12. The women brushed her long, pale hair until it gleamed like glass under the quivering flames. Their low prayers merged into one continuous murmur, words she could barely hear over the hammering of her own heart. The linen shift they placed upon her was too heavy for her slight body, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible crown. A faint perfume of lavender and candle wax clung to the veil, lowered over her head. When they finished, she no longer resembled a child. She looked like a sacrifice. Outside, the winter wind clawed against the walls, desperate to break in. Within, the air itself thickened, heavy with dread and ritual. Down in the great hall, her husband waited, King Richard II of England. He was 29, already hollowed by loss. His first queen, Anne of Bohemia, had died young, and his grief had spread through the kingdom like ash. England had mourned with him. Its bells tolled not only for her death, but for the death of his youth. But kings are not permitted to mourn forever. Peace demanded more than sorrow could pay. So, between England and France, a new accord was forged, not signed in ink, but sealed in flesh. This was no marriage of affection or will. It was an exchange, a living treaty, a child traded for a fragile peace. And to make that promise unbreakable, the union had to be witnessed, verified, and documented beyond doubt. Not for one night, but for 7. 7 nights of observation, intrusion, and what they called consummation, not hidden in privacy, but displayed as ritual. This was no wedding night. It was sanctified captivity, the grim arithmetic of medieval politics, a world where a young girl's body became a legal document and her pain the evidence that bound nations together. Before we enter that chamber, understand this. Every detail you're about to hear comes from real records, royal ledgers, medical accounts, and clerical chronicles preserved for 6 centuries. These are not metaphors, but the cold language of bureaucracy recording cruelty. What happened to Isabel was no crime in her world. It was procedure, a lawful, holy custom sanctioned by church and crown. It was known as the extended bedding or the 7-day verification, a ritual meant to erase doubt by erasing humanity itself. Among medieval nobility, marriage was never about affection. It was a tool, a political weapon meant to forge alliances and secure dynasties. The union of 2 crowns had to prove its worth through the promise of heirs, living proof that peace had taken root. But what if the bride was too young to bear children? What if her body refused? What if rivals or the church questioned the union later? The solution left nothing to faith. They would prove the legitimacy of the marriage by force and record it in ink. A noble bedding ceremony was already brutal by modern eyes. The couple was escorted to bed by attendants, undressed before witnesses and placed under embroidered sheets. Priests stood beside them, chanting blessings over what was about to occur. Outside, nobles waited, listening for signs that the union had been made real. But when the bride was royal, when peace itself depended on her body, the ritual lengthened. Days turned to a week. Witnesses became guards. Privacy disappeared. 7 days, 7 nights. No rest, no escape. Physicians from the French court chronicled these events as though writing scientific reports. Guards stood by the chamber door. Clergymen and nobles entered at scheduled hours to observe and confirm. Servants delivered food, linens, and water. Twice a day, doctors entered to inspect the couple and verify that the act had taken place. Their notes were detached, cold, exacting. They were not voyeurs, they were bureaucrats. Their duty was not curiosity, it was control. For Isabel, this was not the start of life, it was its quiet burial. She was the daughter of King Charles VI of France, remembered as Charles the Mad, and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. Born into silks and ceremony, she had been raised for obedience, not freedom. From birth, her destiny had been written to serve as a bridge, a peace offering, a line in a history written by men. When France and England finally sought to end decades of bloodshed, she became the price of that peace. Richard II, almost 30 and still grieving, resisted at first. The idea of wedding a 12-year-old filled him with unease or shame, but the crown left no room for feelings. The treaty demanded her hand. The contract was sealed, the betrothal declared, and Isabel was sent across the Channel into a realm that had no place for her childhood. The wedding took place in November of 1396. Chroniclers describe splendour, banners fluttering, church bells pealing, feasts stretching for days. Nobles exchanged jewels, priests sang blessings, and both nations rejoiced. To them, it was a miracle. Peace at last, consecrated by marriage. But when the music faded and the goblets emptied, celebration gave way to silence. It was time for the true ritual to begin. Isabel was led through a corridor lit by torches, her veil trembling in the cold air. Her small hands clutched the rosary she had been given, though her lips could form no prayers. At the chamber door, she did not speak, she only nodded as her attendants withdrew. Outside, guards took their stations. Inside, the door shut, and history stopped pretending to be poetry. The chronicles fall silent here, not because scribes were modest, for these same men recorded executions in horrific detail, but because what happened within that room was deemed beyond words. It was too close to blasphemy, too human, too raw. Jean Froissart, a French chronicler, recorded just a single sentence. By royal command, the bedding was prolonged for a week to secure the alliance. Westminster Abbey's archives say it more plainly. Physicians attended daily to confirm that the union had been fulfilled. 7 days. 7 days during which a child's body became the ground on which two kingdoms built their peace. To minds of the era, this was not cruelty. It was logic, the fusion of medicine, law, and faith twisted together to justify the unthinkable. Physicians of the 14th century believed that conception required the woman's pleasure, that her body had to echo the man's desire for life to begin. They claimed a woman must release her own seed for pregnancy to occur. They thought the moon governed fertility, that the body's humours could be tuned through diet, timing, and repetition. And so, for royal unions, court physicians prescribed what they called the full course. 7 days, 7 examinations, 7 recorded acts of verification. Servants delivered meals twice daily, scheduled according to the stars. Candles burned without pause so the doctors could observe. Between each session, the young bride was examined for signs of arousal, for proof that the ritual had succeeded. Reports were written in Latin, signed by witnesses, men of learning, faith, and state, as though documenting an experiment rather than an ordeal. Each record was bound into the royal archives beside the treaty papers as evidence that the alliance had been rightfully sealed. The Latin phrase remains legible even now. Testificatum est copulio perfecto. It is testified. The union is complete. To them, this was proof of divine order. To her, it was the unraveling of everything she was. Imagine the world around you speaking in tongues you cannot understand, deciding what your body must endure in the name of peace. For Isabel, there was no romance, no fairy tale, only repetition wrapped in ceremony. The air was thick with incense, candle smoke, and unspoken fear. Priests murmured blessings outside the door. Guards shifted in the corridor, armor clinking each time they turned. Every sound reminded her she could not escape, that she was no longer a daughter, but property. When she cried, her attendants called it the fear of womanhood. When she trembled, the physicians labelled it reaction. When she bled, they called it proof. This was not a marriage. It was a siege, and her body was the fortress being conquered in the name of order. French envoys stationed at the English court wrote home to Paris throughout the week. Their letters, still preserved, are haunting in their calmness. They mention that the marriage was properly concluded according to custom, that every measure had been observed as required by both crowns. No word of the child, no mention of pain, only assurance that the treaty stood secure. Diplomacy demanded silence. When the seventh day ended, Isabel emerged from the chamber pale as parchment. Her attendants said she spoke barely above a whisper, her eyes hollow, her hands unsteady. She had survived, though what part of her survived was uncertain. Despite the endless rituals, the examinations, the notes of pleasure confirmed, Isabel did not conceive. Her body was too young, her frame too frail, her womb unready for what they demanded. By the final entry, the physician's tone had shifted. Uncertain, clinical, detached, they blamed the timing, they blamed her diet, they never blamed the act itself. And so, after a week of sanctified cruelty, the kingdoms announced that the marriage had been fulfilled, that the alliance between England and France was now unbreakable. The world rejoiced, and the girl at its centre was left with nothing but silence. King Richard's behaviour afterward became a subject of hushed speculation. Some whispered that guilt had consumed him, others claimed disgust. Whatever the reason, he withdrew from Isabel almost entirely. He granted her chambers, attendants, jewels, everything but affection. To his courtiers, she was not a wife, but a symbol, a token of peace, too fragile to touch. In public, he was gentle, courteous, as though trying to erase the memory of what had been done, but he never summoned her to his bed again. Some chroniclers believed he sought confession soon after, whispering remorse to priests who dared not record it. Others said the marriage only deepened his coldness, reopening the wound left by the wife he had lost. Whatever truth lies beneath royal courtesy, one fact remained: they never had children. When Richard was deposed in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, soon crowned Henry IV, Isabel was barely 13. The fallen king was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where he died within a year, starved or quietly murdered. Isabel, widowed before she reached womanhood, was ordered to remain in England. Her dowry, her jewels, even her presence were once more political tools, items to be bargained, not mourned. But the French crown did not forget her. Her father's envoys demanded her return, arguing that the treaty was void now that the marriage was broken. Negotiations dragged on for months, conducted by men who spoke of her as if she were parchment or coin. Finally, in 1401, at 15 years old, Isabel was sent back to France. Records describe her return. She stepped ashore without tears, silent and pale, her hands clasped as though still bound by ritual. The crowd that gathered did not see a queen, but a ghost of one, a child sculpted from duty and grief. She went to live with her mother, Queen Isabeau, who kept her close and quiet. For years, Isabel rarely appeared in public. Some said she refused to wear the crown jewels she once owned, claiming they belonged to another life. Others said she slept each night with a candle burning beside her bed, terrified of darkness, locked doors, and silence. Yet the machinery of monarchy never stopped turning. When Isabel turned 16, she was wed once more, this time to Charles of Orléans, a young noble closer to her own age. Their ceremony was modest, humble even, compared to her first. No royal physicians stood watch. No treaties waited to be sealed. No guards lingered by the door. For the first time in her life, she was allowed to be human, not a symbol. In this second marriage, she bore children. She rediscovered laughter, learned to write letters, to read verse again. Yet, those who knew her said she carried a silence that never lifted, the stillness of someone who had once been turned into evidence. For what happened to her at 12 could never be undone. Her body bore no visible scars, but her soul did. Marks that time could not erase, inherited through every retelling of her story. To her peers, Isabel was the queen who brought peace. To history, she remains a haunting reminder of what peace once demanded. For centuries, her story lingered in the margins, a mere note in treaties, a name on marriage registers, a forgotten entry in chronicles of war and diplomacy. The men who recorded history never placed her at the centre of anything. To them, she was a vessel, a duty fulfilled. But history, like carved stone, preserves echoes long after the voices fade. And if you look closer, you find her, the girl behind the alliance, the child beneath the crown. The world called her blessed. The church deemed her marriage holy, her suffering sanctified. Pain was her dowry, silence, her devotion. Yet the documents from that week, every inspection, every physician's note, every letter home reveal another truth. A truth about a society that could turn cruelty into ceremony and name it civilization. The prolonged bedding, the week-long verification, was not unique to her. Similar customs appear in the archives of Aragon, Castile, and Burgundy. Chroniclers describe noble brides observed by priests and doctors, their privacy stripped away for the sake of political certainty. The church, ever hungry for proof, sanctioned it all. These were not acts of passion, they were acts of bureaucracy. Marriage reduced to a process, womanhood to evidence. In that world, power distrusted the fragile. A child could not be trusted to rule, but her body could be used to seal a throne. It was safer to destroy one girl than to risk another war. The French physicians who oversaw Isabel recorded in detached tones words like temperament, humour, balance, and confirmation of union. To modern readers, their accounts read like autopsies of innocence. They measured her pulse, her tears, her colour, her temperature, as though studying a specimen rather than a human being. One wrote, "The maiden shows nervous trembling at intervals, appetite reduced, complexion pale but sound." That phrase, "but sound," chills more than any wound. It meant she lived, and that, to them, was enough. No words from Isabel herself survive. No journal, no letter, no confession. The silence of girls like her is one of history's great voids. Their thoughts weren't lost to time, they were erased by design. Their pain was never meant to be remembered. Only the men's voices, the ones who orchestrated it, remain. Each signature, each line of ink pressing another layer of authority onto her memory. Between those sterile records, you can still hear her breathing, small, frightened, human, the last trace of a child, forced to play the part of a queen. When her story resurfaced centuries later, scholars argued over its meaning. Some romanticized her as the child bride who saved nations. Others dismissed it as political routine, no more tragic than any war. Yet what makes her story horrifying is not its rarity, but how common it truly was. In an age when treaties were signed in blood, when heirs were currency, girls like Isabel existed everywhere, traded across borders, sanctified by priests, and blessed as they wept. In a world ruled by men, purity was property, and when power demanded proof, the proof was taken. By the time her husband, Charles of Orléans, was captured at Agincourt in 1415, Isabel was already gone dead at 20. Chronicles say she fell ill, consumed by grief and frailty. But even in death, her image was used. Artists painted her serene and saintly, surrounded by angels. The girl who had once been examined, measured, and verified was remade into a vision of divine patience. They made her gentle again, as if the world could atone through art. In stained glass and illuminated manuscripts, she remains forever 12-veiled, silent, trapped in that first winter night. Modern historians call the extended bedding custom one of the darkest stains of medieval marriage, a ritual that exposed how power could disguise cruelty as order. It was, in every sense, a ceremony of control. It turned intimacy into inspection and made the human body into political evidence. And though centuries separate us, its echo lingers. Every culture that has demanded proof of purity, every system that reduced women to emblems of peace or shame, still carries her shadow. Her name is seldom spoken, yet she stands as one of history's earliest victims of bureaucratic violence, the kind that wears robes instead of armour, speaks Latin instead of rage, and calls itself righteous. She did not choose her crown, her husband, or her destiny. She chose only to endure. Walk through the ruins of old castles, Westminster, Windsor, the keeps along the Channel, and fragments of her world remain, cold corridors, narrow chambers, iron locks, rooms built not for comfort, but for control. They smell of wax, of damp stone, of memories that refuse to fade. And if you listen long enough, you might almost hear her breath, the rustle of linen, the prayer whispered too late. The past does not vanish. It lingers in ritual, in record, in the shadows where power once called itself holy. Isabel of Valois never ruled a realm. She never led armies or signed decrees. Yet through her suffering, two kingdoms found a fragile peace, and history moved forward, stepping over her as though she were part of the floor. That is how civilization often builds itself, not on progress, but on endurance, not on mercy, but on silence. And so the candles still burn for her, a girl in white, standing in a fortress of grey stone, waiting for a future that never came.